Okay. There's like a thing, an art scroll book called Let's Really Learn Some Torah. You know that book? You never know what that really is. I say that to my kids all the time. Let's really learn some Torah. Anyway, enough distractions. Hi, Danielle. So today we really should focus because we're going to try to do a lot of things in this talk, in this class. We are going to read Psalm 51, and I just had this feeling while reading Psalm 51, and we've talked about this before. I just remembered the expression that gets said that Purim is, which one is it? Yom Kippur Kippurim or Purim Kippur? One or the other. I think Purim is like Yom Kippur. And I was
Kippur is like Purim.
Is that what it is?
Yeah,
okay,
Purim,
so you see, I don't really know.
Kippur is not as
Well, let's get there. Okay, so this comes from the Tikkunei Zohar. I don't know the provenance of this book. Right, it's not Chazal, it's not the sages, it's not the Rishonim, whatever. But it's something. It seems like something worth pursuing, and it's something I've been thinking about really for a very, very long time. And I thought when I finally read Psalm 51, things started to come together for me. But I want to read, first of all, I want to read a couple of midrashim. Actually, let's start with Esther. You know what's a good thing to do before Purim? To read Megillat Esther. It's an excellent thing to do. Because then you're like in shul, and you have I always bring a book, and I wish I had a scroll, but I bring a book, and I'm always like, oh, that's interesting, and I start to look at commentary, and then that's the end of the Megillah, right? And they're really, even though there's so many leniencies in terms of reading the Megillah, one of them is not listening to it, right? I mean, I think there is a question, like if you fall asleep during reading the Megillah, are you yotze? Like the Gemara is already going crazy because there's so many kulot, there's so many leniencies. But falling asleep, actually the Gemara also considers, and we may come back to this, the Gemara considers whether or not you are allowed to read the Megillah backwards, right? The sages have a good time, right? So, I think the answer is no, but there is the question we would obviously ask is what's the Havamina, right? Why would we think that's much? Anyway, so we'll keep that in mind. And then al kain karo liyamim ha'ela Purim, al shem hapur, al kain kol divrei ha'igeret hazot umaru al kacha umahagia aleim. There's so much in this pasuk. These days are called Purim, Yud Bet, and Tetvav, and it's al shem hapur. Somebody remind us, what is the pur that's being spoken about here?
The lot.
Pardon?
The lot, or they cast the lot.
Right, so Haman casts a lot, and he says, I'm going to determine the day the Jews die by lottery. It is going to be as random as possible. I'm going to choose a lot, and whatever comes out, comes out. That's Haman's mindset. We've been talking about different temporal perspectives, and the mindset of Haman is shit happens, basically, meaning, or essentially a version of carpe diem, seize the day, meaning do whatever you want, right? Al shem hapur, al kain al kol divrei ha'ageret hazot, and when you hear the Megillah, either tomorrow night or on Thursday night, watch the way in which the Megillah calls itself different things. Sometimes it calls itself an igeret, sometimes it calls itself a sefer. If anybody were as old as I am here, you would remember the commercial for the Razzles. Do you remember Razzles candy? The question would be, is it a candy or is it a gum? That was like my first exposure to philosophy, like this category violation or ambiguity. Right. So is the letter is it a letter or is it a book? And they're also.
By the way, Professor, Igeret is epistle, not a letter.
Okay, it's an epistle. Right. Fine. Right. And there are all sorts of halachot which emphasize how the Megillah should be distinct from other books. On the one hand, it's included with the holy books, but if you have a giant scroll, they used to have these giant scrolls, and they put all the Tanakh in them. If you put the Megillah in it, it had to be a different size cloth. So the Megillah is simultaneously acknowledged as part of the Torah, but different from the rest of the Torah. And the ambiguity between Sefer and Igeret, that gets to that. Maybe we'll come back to that. I want to look at a couple of midrashim here, and to keep in mind from this pasuk, this idea of time being random, and how that, and obviously how that is undone by the end of the story. Okay, I'm going to read this fast, I think, in Hebrew. I'm going to read two long Megillah, two long midrashim, Agadatas. Okay, here we go. The students of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai asked, for what reason were the enemies of the Jewish people, a euphemism for the Jewish people in that generation? So for what reason were the Jews in Shushan, why were they deserving of annihilation? What was the question of punishment? Of course, also we keep in mind, when reading, on Purim, one of the ways of understanding Purim is the fundamental difference between it and Chanukah, right? Chanukah is based, everything in Chanukah is, for lack of a better term, spiritual, right? The priests can't light the oil. The miracle is a miracle of light. It's kind of like the holiday of Hanukkah. I don't want to get too distracted. It's really a holiday of perception. So the Bach, a halachic posek, he says, well, in Hanukkah, our observances reflect that. We light candles. There's no mitzvah of eating on Hanukkah. The Hasmoneans, this is the key point, the Hellenists rather, the Hellenists, what did they want to do? They didn't want to kill the Jews. They wanted to convert them, right? That's the fundamental difference. Keep your bodies, we just want your minds, right? On Purim, it's entirely different. That is, Haman wants to annihilate all of the Jewish people. And because the day was a day, first of all, Purim, how were they redeemed? Through children crying out, through lamentation, through fasting. Their repentance is done with the body. And the celebration is also done with the body. Again, on Hanukkah, there is no mitzvah to have a meal. There's disagreement, but that's the pshat, the pashtut, is there's no mitzvah to have a meal on Hanukkah. But there is a mitzvah, obviously, it's one of the 4 mitzvot of Purim, to have a meal on Purim. I mentioned that here, and now the Gemara here is going to go into this question, well, why were they sentenced to annihilation, for their bodies to be erased, right? It is because, the sin itself was they partook of the feast of the wicked one, Achashverosh. Achashverosh makes this big feast. Where does he make it? I don't know if anybody's from Long Island. Anybody ever been to Leonard's? Leonard's is this giant, no, it's not a joke for anybody, sorry. Anyway, imagine the giant Simcha complex in your neighborhood, and imagine it as lavish as possible. So that's where it's happening, and everything is kadat v'kedin, everything is galat kosher, right? The mashgiach comes out and talks to everybody, and I'm reassuring everybody of the kashrut, but nonetheless, they're eating at the wrong meal. So here we go. Let's go. So they said to him, it is because they partook of the feast of that wicked one, Achashverosh, and they partook their forbidden fruits. That's a machlok. That's not. Some people say all the food was kosher. If so, those in Shushan should have been killed as punishment. So the Gemara asks, well, okay, I understand the Jews in Shushan should have been punished, but why the whole world? They said to him, the Rabbanim said to him, then you say a response to our question. He said to them, it is because they prostrated themselves before a Avodah Zarah. So when Haman comes out, or maybe this is even at the meal, let's read this, the parish here says that Nebuchadnezzar had made, as is recorded, that the entire world bowed down before it. So not only is this feast on the temple vessels, there's a beautiful Rembrandt painting of Belshazzar's feast, where we see Belshazzar eating off the temple vessels. So whatever midrashim are inherited, Rembrandt gets them also. This idea of this entirely lavish feast, which has all the decorations, as it were, they're decorating the place here for Purim, of the Beit HaMikdash. So, okay, so they all bow down. So now the Gemara is going to ask, let's see, Amrulo, kimasu pani yesh bedavar. Was there some favoritism going on? Is it true that they worshipped idols and therefore deserved to be destroyed? Why was there a miracle performed on their behalf? And here it is. Here's what's actually said. Panim, I think, was it done for, I guess, I don't know how they get favoritism. Amrlen, heim lo asu el lifni. This is tricky here. So let's read how it's translated. They did not really worship the idol, but pretended to do so lifnim, for appearance's sake, acting out as if they were carrying out the king's command to bow before the idol, as if. So too, the Holy One, blessed be He, did not destroy them, but it did act angry with them. Only lifnim, for appearance. The whole thing is like a hatzagah. The whole thing is a show. The whole thing is a performance, right? He merely pretended to desire to destroy them, as all he did was issue a threat, but in the end, the decree was annulled, and this is as it is written, for he does not afflict him from his heart. Willingly, we don't know how they darshan that here, but I want to remember this idea from Purim, that there's idea that the Jews, this whole thing was put on as some kind of show. What is it a show for? I'm not really sure yet. Anybody want to suggest something before we go on? What this would be a show for? Oh, Kira, so good to see you. Why would God enact this show?
To get them to repent, it seems to be the basic response.
Okay, let's keep that in mind. You got them to repent. Okay. Let's continue though, okay? So now this is a different midrash. This is from Esther Rabbah, and this is another long one. After he erected the gibbet, I guess that's the place where somebody gets hung, he went to Mordechai, Haman, and found that he was sitting in the study hall with children sitting before him with sackcloths on their waists. So here's this drama now that the midrash is creating. Haman is looking for Mordechai. He's rigged this gallows, which he has rigged for Mordechai. And this is an important detail in the Purim story. It's he himself who is hung on it, right? And when the Medrash talks about this, it quotes the Psalm that we read together about somebody plotting something and it turning against them. So that's actually what's happening here. And Mordechai is surrounded by children, and they're all counting. And there are 22,000 of them. And Haman cast iron chains on them and deployed guards over them. He said, tomorrow I will kill these children first, and then I will hang Mordechai. Their mothers were bringing them food and water and saying to them, our children, eat and drink before you die, and don't die hungry. So the mothers come in and intervene. I mean, this scene is really incredible, right? The kids are all crying around him and they're fasting. And then there's this moment of feminine compassion and chesed, and they come in and they say, even though you're scheduled to die, don't die hungry. Eat and drink before you die and don't die hungry. Immediately they placed their hands on their books and took an oath. By the life of our master, our teacher, Mordechai, we will not eat and drink, but we will die while fasting. And what are they doing? I mean, I just never got this medrash. It's like, do we admire this? Like children fasting? Isn't somebody going to come in and say like where, isn't Mordechai going to say, don't fast? I mean, it just seemed very, very strange to me. And there are all sorts of halachot also about protecting life and every single moment of life. This always seems strange to me. So let's sit on that for a little. All of them begin weeping loudly and their cries reach the heavens. The Holy One, blessed be He, heard the sound of their weeping at 2 a.m., whatever that means, it certainly means something. At that moment, the compassion of the Holy One, blessed be He, was aroused. At that moment, the weeping of the children. And he stood from his throne of justice, he got up from the throne of din, and he sat on the throne of mercy on Rachamim. And he says, just a very bizarre story, what is that loud sound I hear that sounds like goats and lambs? And then a cameo appearance by Moses, right? I mean, you have to just recuperate the weirdness of this thing, right? Moses, our master, stood before the Holy One, blessed be He, and said, Master of the universe, they are neither goats nor lambs, but rather the children of your people who are fasting today. 3 days and 3 nights. At that moment, the Holy One, blessed be, he took the letters that he had decreed, the gezerot, not letters, it's gezerot, the decrees, I think, that were sealed with mortar against him. And if it is letters, tell me, it is a gerut. Okay, that were sealed with mortar seals, and he ripped them. It's not mortar seals. There are two kinds, or maybe one kind of seal is teat, clay. I don't know actually how this worked. You make a decree and you seal it with clay. And yeah, that's something you've seen. That's a thing, to seal the decree with clay.
Well, isn't it like like the prints?
So I always thought that was wax. Okay, so it's clay. Now I see it a little bit better. And there's another midrash that says, oh, had the gezerah, had the decree been decreed in blood, then it would have been non-negotiable, right? Then it would have been over. But because it was clay and not blood, and obviously there's some distinction there, maybe let's just keep in our head that the Maharal says that the teat, the clay, emphasizes physicality, and the blood, dam, nefesh, emphasizes the spirit in some sense. I don't know what we're going to do with that yet, but I think it's important to keep that in mind. It may help us later, but because it is sealed in clay, he can undo the decree. And on that night, and then we go back to Esther, the story, sleep deserted, the king wakes up. Oh, Jeff Bloom's in the waiting room. The king wakes up, and this is the one time, the Medrash says this is the one time that God's name is implied in the text. When Achashverosh wakes up, it's not just Achashverosh the king, it's Achashverosh the king of kings. And this idea that they're waking up on two different levels. And interesting, what Achashverosh does when he wakes up is he calls in for a book, telling you that the Megillah is just like obsessed with writing, with books and letters. And of course, we know in the beginning, Achashverosh sends letters, and he sends more letters, and letters get sent back and forth, and letters, right? I mean, it's this proliferation of kind of text. I think in some way, the Megillah is like, Shushan is a decadent place. It's a decadent civilization. So they have Facebook and Twitter, and hey Jeff, and they're constantly sending people messages to each other, right? There's an overflow of information. And what happens at the end, and this is a very short story, a long story short, is there is one book that is in fact sent to the Jewish people, and that is the Megillah, right? And that establishes the holiday for generations to come. So the Sefer, the book, triumphs over all these letters that are coming in different directions. We're giving short shrift to that. Okay, but so good. So let's see what we have learned so far. We did two things. One, the first medrash we learned, we see that in some sense the Gemara is suggesting that this whole thing was lifnim, for appearances. And it was a hatzagah, it was a play that had to be played out. So we're keeping that in mind. And the other thing that we're keeping in mind is this idea of the young children. They're the ones that are convinced, as it were, the divine. And it takes a while for him to even understand, because God suddenly says, God makes, as it were, a mistake and says, what are these animals? Why are these lambs wailing for? And it's Moses who has to come in and explain it to God. So like what happens in this story such that God is confused and that Moses has to come and clarify? So, and now let's take a 1 second break. Okay. And as we take this break, our leap of faith for today is that we will read through Psalm 51. That's really not a leap of faith. Well, God willing, we will do it together. But what I want to open our minds really to this psalm and read it like we've been reading every other psalm, and then come back to the issues that we addressed. And hopefully we'll have some more clarity. So Psalm 51 is a notable psalm because this is the main event in David's life. Tikva, part of the psalm posse, look what she put together, the David timeline, right? This is available, people. And we will send it out freely. There are some funny parts, but a lot, as Tikva said, a lot of things happened in David's life, but really the primary one to happen, or the one that is central, is the sin of Bathsheba. We discussed this when we learned the Psalm 3, when we saw David in exile, and we really need to know about David's sin from the very beginning, because it's this unworthiness. I mean, he feels unworthy for many, many reasons, but it's primarily this sin for which he feels absolute desolation and unworthiness. And here we don't have the act dramatized, but we have this is kind of like the comic book heading. Meanwhile, in Gotham City, with Nathan is coming to visit David, Asher Ba, after he Ba El Bathsheba. Natan is the prophet Shmuel, of course, anoints David. Shmuel dies, and Natan comes and rebukes David for this sin. And I think we start as Ed and Tikva pointed out to me earlier. This line, which we get a version of this line in 52 as well, a kind of this is the frame for it. And I think in that psalm in 52 and also here, this is David's voice, where it's like, that's the heading, here we start. Chaneni Elokim chasadecha, karov rachamecha machei pashi. So one of the things we've been talking about a lot is taking what seems like generic language and reading it carefully. Because it's so easily to look at the Psalms and think, oh yeah, generic Psalm line, generic Psalm line, generic Psalm line. But one of the things we've been discovering is that every Psalm almost has its own language, its own vocabulary, and there are repetitions of terms. So even though it may look generic, we have to pay close attention. Chaneni Elokim kechasadecha, according to your kindness. What is, so we've got like we used to say when we read Donne's poetry. There's drama here. In Donne's poetry, there's a guy and a girl. Who's part of the cast of characters here? It's not a hard one. Remember Donne's holy sonnets, right? Which are probably modeled on the Psalms, definitely modeled on the Psalms. The character is David and God. David is calling out to the divine. And he's asking him, for his mercy. You're the translator now. Karov rachamecha. How would you translate that? Somebody translated. I think the Koran says tender mercies. It's like, please. I know I can't say tender mercies without thinking of Shirley MacLaine. You're all probably much too young for that movie, right? Did you ever see Tender Mercies? It's like it's Shirley MacLaine at her most indulgent, and she gets pretty self-indulgent. Anyway, so I mean, translators have to be careful, obviously, with those kinds of things. Karov rachamecha, your abundant passion, your great passion. It's definitely intensified. Machei pashai, blot out my transgressions. So if we're making up the scene here and thinking about, well, where are we when we're meeting David? What is his psychic state? How's he feeling at the moment? Come on, guys. This is
like he totally he screwed up and he needs,
he's in a very, very bad place.
Yeah.
Why do you say screwed up?
I mean, I don't know he did something wrong. He did something wrong. I don't know what he thinks he did wrong, whether it's that he slept with Bathsheba and then
David has
her husband.
Right. So on the one hand, you're saying, right, he feels badly because he's transgressed, but he has this overwhelming sense of unworthiness. What is karov rachamecha? Why that emphasis on karov rachamecha? And I'm not even sure yet if David knows that he's been forgiven for the sins. I think Radak says that karov rachamecha is David has been assured by God that he's going to be forgiven for the sin of Bathsheba, or he didn't really sin or whatever. But David still has this overpowering sense of unworthiness. I think that's a little bit, Danielle, what you're referring to when he's screwed up. It's like he's over the top here. So he says to God, so Danielle, you were saying something.
No, I wasn't saying anything other than I don't know if we know what he thinks he's done wrong. Like that's what's not clear is,
what are the possibilities?
No, I think he knows he's done something wrong. I don't think, because he knows that he was wrong to have Uri killed at the front line. He knows that was wrong. He murdered a man for his own benefit.
Right, excellent. So he raped Bathsheba, right? And he, in order to cover up his sin, he sends Uriah to the line. Now, of course, the Gemara goes through all these reasons why he really didn't do it. It really was a marriage. But in David's head, what I just said in the strongest sense, he raped Bathsheba and he killed Uriah. That's what he thinks. That's what he thinks in his heart of hearts. Because he's the most honest person in the world, and
most introspective
before Hamlet, right? And he's not, even if on some sense he has the idea that it's okay, he cannot let it go. So the first line is David asking for his sins to be wiped away. And the second line
is the word pshay, the word pshay, that's different than chet, right? It seems like he feels stupid as well as repentant.
But why do we say pshay is?
In my, at least in Aramaic, the pshia is like a mistake. So I don't know if Hebrew that was.
Sorry,
good, excellent. But there is that sense. Yes,
Pesha is much more severe. If there's like a felony, it's an intentional.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Herev, and here's another kind of variation of the rove that we saw early, I think, right? Magnify my cleaning, clean me well. Kapseni, me avoni, umi chatasi, tahareni. So in the first line, in line 3, David says, blot out my transgressions. In line 4, those transgressions are still, it's again intensified. Clean me from my sin and from my mi'avoni, my iniquity, and from my sin, cleanse me. What's the difference between macheh and tahareni? Right, in line 3, we get macheh pashai.
Macheh is a race. Macheh is a race.
Yeah. And no, this is an idea of purification, I see. Right. And
he wants a clean slate, like a double
the Medrashim and say that this is like the language of the mikvah. That David he considers himself to be outside of the camp. We've talked a lot about that, about David's kind of negative fantasies, that this whole mission that has been articulated for him already, that he's somehow not going to live up to it. And we've seen David think of himself as a version of the Metzora, right? The person who finds himself outside of the camp. This lashon of tahareni, tumat b'tahara. He needs to be purified. And that pashai that you mentioned, or that we mentioned in line 3, it occurs again, it appears again in line 5. He fashayani. Sorry, and that you can read it like that also. I am my sins. Ki fashayani eda. I recognize my transgressions. V'chatasi negdi Samid. I like Ashkenaz reading the Psalms. I just do. I think it's got a little bit more. I think the pathos gets emphasized a little bit more. It's funny. Sephardim have the custom on Erev Shabbat to sing Shir Hashir, and it's. Have you ever been to a Sephardi, like a Moroccan shul? And it's completely communal. It's very, very beautiful. It's unheard of in an Ashkenaz shul, because in Ashkenaz shul everything's like completely chaotic. So the Ashkenazim were Europeans, right? And there is that sense of European individuality, right? That the prayer is the Ashkenazim are much better, I think, at understanding, because of the cultural background, this individual prayer. And from my own perspective, that other more communal prayer is very far from my experience. So anyway, you get the pathos here. What is this? I sinned against you always? Again, sin is unworthiness. I mean, I don't know, do I have the license to say that sin is unworthiness? I like to avoid the idea of sin because it sounds so Christian. I grew up in a secular environment. So for me, sin was always very bad. I guess sin is bad, right? But it always seemed to be something that I never related to. And I think David is telling us that sin is this feeling of constant unworthiness, of constantly being unable to stand before God. That's the negdi tamid. I'm always conscious of my sin whenever I'm in front of you. Let's continue. Lecha levadcha chatasi. Lecha levadcha chatasi. If you were going to ask a question here, what would your question be? What do you mean? What do you mean, God? What do you mean, David? You sinned it only in front of God? What about that Shavah, right?
What about Uriah?
What about Uriah? So the Radak says that David is saying, you're the only one who knows about this. Everybody else thinks I'm a tzaddik. That's what I was saying before, right? Everybody else thinks I'm a tzaddik. They think I arranged this marriage thing and sent it to Uriah. They think they believe in all the kvetches that the Gemara makes, but I know that only you know. That deep sense of unworthiness that no one else knows. As you said, see, right? Introspection, honesty. V'hara be'einecha asiti. And the evil in your eyes, I did it. And why did I do it? So, leman tzdak b'dvarecha tische b'shavtecha. V'shavtecha. Against you alone I have sinned, and I did evil in your eyes. Asiti. In the next psalm, David says to God, Asita, Asiti, Laman tzdak, such that I'm not looking at the translation. Without looking at it, how are we going to translate this? Laman tzdak b'dvarecha tische b'shavtecha. No cheating. Such that you will be justified in your words, and you will merit and when you will be right in your judgment.
Maybe, Professor, maybe his version of theodicy is trying to vindicate God's judgment by sinning.
You wanted to get milk in it, right? So David is here trying to justify the ways of God to man. But that's very interesting, see, because it's not God talking, it's David, right? It's kind of, I think you're suggesting it's like David is saying, I've got an idea for you, God, right? I think there might be a shift here, right? That you will be right in your judgment. What is this judgment? We'll have to come back to that. Hen ba'avon holalati v'chet yichmateni imi. Indeed, I was born ba'avon holalati ubecheta yechmatni imi. So anybody who thinks that this is somehow a Jewish expression of original sin, I said this to my exclusive Psalm posse, but I will say it all to you, is a moron, right? Meaning you cannot extrapolate a theological principle really from any of Jewish texts, because Jewish texts are so complex that they refuse principles in a way, at least simple ones. But you can't build the whole idea of original. It's crazy, really. I mean, because in a few lines, we'll see that the whole idea, and I mean, the Christian idea of original sin, what does that require? What does original sin require in Christianity? I mean, because of original sin, you need Jesus, right? You need this narrative by which men are in. I mean, obviously there are variations within Christian different denominations, but men are evil, and they need this extrinsic force to redeem them, right? And David says then, right? So it's not, this is another expression of David is just utter, he is in that place where he feels total unworthiness. Hein emet chafatzta betuchot ubesatum chachmato di'eni. Indeed, you desire hein again, hein emet chafatzta. You wanted truth. And then there's about vatuchot, in things that are, what is vatuchot? Right, it's a weird thing, inner recesses, uvastum, in things that are shut up. One reason it's also confusing is you read through it, hein emet chafatzta betuchot uvastum, meaning there's a temptation to read beyond the pause here, which means that right in the middle of the psalm, we see this so many times, you have this shut up, closed place, right? And David here at the end is asking, Chachmato di'eni. I mean, that's he's saying, like, I'm so closed. I know you want the truth. Oh, teach me wisdom about secret things. Oh, I see. Teach. So I always read, every time I read it wrong. And then we stop here, and in secret things, ubestum chachma todi'eni. So reveal to me, inform me of these, of your secrets. Is that satisfying? Right. I mean, I guess, right. I think David, and you see that he's introspective, right? But David is saying, I need chachma to understand my inner world. I need more language for it, right? I need you to help me understand my inner world. Then we get more of the purity stuff. Purge me with hyssop till I am pure, wash me till I am whiter than snow. This is actually where Radak says this has to do with ritual purity. The hyssop is used in the process of bringing the Metzora back into the camp. And then in 10, Kasimenu sasam besimcha taglenu atzamos dechisa. This seems like it might be a turning point, but let me hear tidings of joy and gladness, and then let the bones you have crushed exalt. Every time, even here when David is mentioning his possible future triumph, he's remembering his crushed bones, right? And look, if we thought that David was kind of snapping out of it, look at line 10, Haster Panecha. Right there is Purim, right? Because of course Purim is the holiday of Hester Panim. So here David is saying, I'm not making any connection, but obviously there is some. Haster panecha michatai, right? Don't even look at me, right? This psalm could really be subtitled, could be called the human stain, right? However David tries to clean himself, he cannot clean himself. Haster panecha michatai, I can't clean myself, don't look at me. And actually we saw that before. It's like he's going back to what he said before. And this goes back to what Daniel said earlier, like it's kind of desperate. Lev tahor barali Elokim. So I think this is like the shift. I think there's a shift here, just like we talked about this in the Ila on Yom Kippur. It's like man is bad, man is like animals, and then there's like, but man has certain attributes which make him different. Lev tahor barali, you created for me a pure heart. Right after all this language of impurity, also right. But Lev Tahor Barali, Elokim, Baruch Nachon Chadesh B'Kirbi. I love this. Ruach Nachon. I mean, it seems very modest, doesn't it? Ruach Nachon, right? I mean, what does Nachon mean? It comes from something. I mean, I guess it actually works with the root, right? We think of Nachon as correct, but it's firm or to be stable or to be established. I wonder, is Nachon ever used in that other sense in Tanakh? That would be an interesting question. Is it used in our sense? Fashion for me a pure heart, create in me a steadfast spirit. We said before that David is asking for a language of the heart. Ruach nachon chadesh b'kirbi. What does the Ruach nachon mean here? What does he want? First of all, this idea of renewal. Well, how does the Ruach nachon lead to renewal? But also, and note again the internal, b'kirbi, inside me. Right? We take this language for granted because it's so much part of the culture we live in. But David is inventing it, right? And then remember, here, anybody who goes to shul regularly, or even on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, a major part of the liturgy, right? Gets repeated in times of it'll be said tomorrow, fast day, right? Times of penitence. It's a four verses. This gets said, right? This desperation, do not cast me out. And that's also bad. Like, do not throw me away, right? Cast me out is too King Jamesy, right? He's being tossed out. He's being thrown away. Don't take away my spirit. So on the one hand, we can read it like Radak does, that he has no Ruach HaKodesh anymore. He's totally abandoned by the divine. Or as you can say, we can read it like we read it, which is the same as Radak, is that he feels completely abandoned by God. He feels completely worthless.
Could this refer to Nevuah specifically?
Oh, yeah, right. So that's what Radak says, right? Right. And then next line, Hashiva li sason yishecha, return me to joy. This idea of return, yishecha, to your salvation. V'ruach nediva tismacheni. What do you do with that? So Hashivile Sason Yishecho, Baruch Nedivat Tismacheni. Let a vigorous spirit sustain me. I don't even know what that's talking about. Let's even see what Karen is doing. Sorry. Resources. Why am I not here? Shouldn't there be translations here? Oh, translation's good. Okay, not this one. See, not JPS 1917. There we go. Let's just see how this works out for us. And uphold me with, it's more literal here, and uphold me with a willing spirit. What, okay, Ruach Nadiva, a voluntary spirit, a voluntarist spirit. How would we translate this? A willing spirit, tismacheni, support me. What does the Nadiva qualify God or David? It's obviously both, right? Right. God is going to uphold, God is going to be the voluntarist here. But on another way of looking at it is the Ruach Nediva is David. And this is another one of those paradoxes that we see in Psalms, according to this reading, is God makes it possible for something to happen. God makes it possible for me to act freely. Right? God is giving, that's David is asking God, let me be a free person. Let me be a free agent. And here he's trying to twist God's arm, right? This is the idea. Alamda poshaim darchecha v'chataim elecha yeshuvu. When the Gemara,
I feel like David wants a full, complete swap out of who he is, like from the Lev to the Ruach. And it's like, it just feels like he's so absolutely disgusted with himself. And he just can't even believe that this is who he is in the world. And like, it just feels like there's a desperate plea for like, just becoming somebody completely new.
I mean, and this line, Chazal say, I mean, this is the most compelling on one way, the least compelling, and also in another way, the most compelling understanding of David is that they say that David sinned so that he could bring tshuva into the world. It's a hatzaka. It's play. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure of what I just said. I'm not sure how that resonates in relationship to what we said about Purim. Let's continue though first. And this is part of David trying to convince God. I will teach others. And what am I going to teach others? That tshuva is possible. The temporality of Psalms is weird. Remember in, I think, Psalm 3, again, we saw all the Talmidei Chachamim of the generation, Doeg, Achitophel, Shaul, and they're all Rishayim. And they all look at David and they say, you are done. Your sin, it makes you unredeemable. It's interesting that that comes so early, right? You are unredeemable. And we know, because we know this psalm, that David brings tshuva into the world. And because there is tshuva, there is a direction forward. Tshuva is Judaism's answer to Jesus. I mean, it comes before. We don't need Jesus because the mechanism that Jesus is, it brings the evil, redeems man. Tshuva is David's self-redemption. With his ruach nadiva. And he says to God, I will teach others. Let me go back. Yeah.
So I think that Yehuda brought a tshuva into the world at the time of
Helene, okay, I don't want to go there now. Okay, let's continue, right? I'm sure it's a great point, but I just want to continue. Hitzileni midomim, deliver me from the blood on my hands, Elohim, Elokai. So here's a shift, right? All of a sudden now we go from Elohim to Elokai. Hatzileni midomim Elohim Elokai shuasi. Tiranein lishoni tzidkecha. Tzidka secha. Tzidka techa. My tongue shall sing aloud. Tiranein with an ayin. I learned this morning is to celebrate, I think. But this is actually to sing aloud. Tiranein lishoni, my tongue will sing of your justice. So my question is here, in the beginning of in the line previous, David is saying, allow for tshuva in the world. Why is he saying, rescue me from all of my guilt, which is so deep inside of me, and my tongue will sing about your justice? Shouldn't it be about your mercy here? Rachamim, something like that? So maybe it's right. This where David is helping God reinvent what justice is. Justice is always inflected by the possibility of tshuva. This is your justice now, God. Let me do tshuva so I can teach others. Again, like the way I'm learning this, which is the way the Gemara learns it, is so radical when you hear it that you can't really believe it. But that is actually what's happening. David is inventing tshuva and saying to God, let's go with it. And if you go with it, now your justice your justice just got upgraded. And got upgraded because of the introduction of tshuva, and now I'm going to sing about it. And also part of it is with David is, if you let me do tshuva, I'll be around, right? I'll be around to sing your song. And who better than David to sing? We were talking before about asking God for agency, or God allowing for agency. So this, anybody who's prayed at all in the Jewish liturgy, Hashem Sfastai Tiftach Ufiya Gitilatecha, this verse precedes every single standing Amidah, morning, afternoon, and night. The main prayer in the Jewish liturgy, it's the beginning of each one. Hashem Sfastai Tiftach Ufiya Gitilatecha. And this really demonstrates just what we were saying. God, you open my lips, right? God's agency, Ufiya Gitilatecha. If you open my lips, I will praise you. That's why to talk about doctrine and Judaism, free will and providence and determinism, it's not possible if you're a philosopher, because Judaism is, philosophers here, because Judaism is always going to refuse the categories of philosophers. I mean, this verse itself just needs to be unpacked a billion times, right? How is it possible that these things coexist? But they do. You didn't require sacrifice, you don't require burnt offerings. And here, now this is also familiar to us as the cliche that you stand in front of God with a broken heart. Well, here we have to feel it in David's words originally, right? God does not want your sacrifices, not at this point. He doesn't want them. If you're going to bring a sacrifice, and line 21 suggests that they will, if you're going to bring a sacrifice, you better be in the right place, because otherwise it's the wrong thing. God, before you do any of that stuff with the korbanot, the temple's not even built yet, right? Before you get there, you better be an upright person. We said this also in relationship to Psalm 30, remember? We didn't talk about it altogether, but Psalm 30 is Chanukah Tabayit David. It's about the sanctification of the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, and in no place in that psalm does it talk about the temple. It just talks about David's eternal life. And we said then, as we can say now, that the temple is not just some building built by anybody. If you're not the right person to build it, if you don't have a pure heart or whatever is required, you're not building any temples, right? You're not building any outer shows of religiosity if you haven't got it together yourself. And here's the Az techbos. This is obviously, messianic. For the Radak who says that David loses his Ruach HaKodesh, says in these two lines, and now we're back to the big lens, the big picture, build the city of Jerusalem, and then you shall be pleased with the sacrifices of righteousness, with burnt offerings and whole, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in the meantime, the psalm is really about feeling this desolation and believing in the possibility of a future, believing in the possibility of tshuva. Purim, what happens in Shushan? What do the Jews do? Esther calls the shots, right? Tells Mordechai to stand in the gates of Shushan, and am I getting this right? And to put on sackcloth and to mourn. The children in the midrash that we saw are mourning. Let's talk a little bit more. We said here, according to Pshat here, really. David says, like the Gemara says, this all happened so David could teach tshuva. How is there a parallel between the sense of this, like this was just a show put on here, to what we saw earlier in relationship to Purim? Here, when we're talking about tshuva, what actually happens in the Purim story? That's a question that could take 3 or 4 hours to answer. What actually happens in the Purim story when we say, "V'ven hafuchu," right? Things got turned upside down. So we thought one thing. I mean, that's the thing about Purim. We thought one thing, and we thought reality meant one thing. Like we thought Haman was building the gallows for Mordechai, and it turns out that wasn't the case. Now, it could have been the case, but God undoes the gezerah at the end. It could have been the case that history would have gone in one direction, but when God hears the children crying and lamenting, and here it's important, I think, to talk about what we said earlier, that he hears the sound of crying of animals. When God moves from the kisei of din to the kisei of rachamim, the kisei of din to the kisei where we see lamentation and tshuva, at that point, especially again what we said about the Purim story, God is like hearing just the animal voice of the human, right? And that's what he reacts to, because we're not in the realm, Yom Kippur, Kippurim, but also they're entirely different. Yom Kippur is entirely on this volitional level, rational level, right? On Yom Kippur, the seal is with dam. On Purim, however, where everything is connected to the body, the seal is with teat, the seal is with clay. It can be undone. And it's as if on Purim, this really, you're all invited to my house in Jerusalem on Friday, because this comes out much better when you're drinking, right? It really does. It makes much more sense. It does. There is and that's because Purim is a holiday of the body. And on Purim, we discover that what we thought isn't. In a way, there's kind of a parallel between the divine on Purim and the individual on Yom Kippur. You thought it was one way, and this is tshuva, right? Tshuva is, and not only what Danielle said, that's one form of tshuva is I hate myself and I want to be a new person. That's tshuva mi yira. Tshuva mi ava is I'm going to try to love myself and go back into the past and rewrite my story such that it gives me a future, right? And that's what God does on Purim. He rewrites the story. Oh, now I get it. He rewrites the story in such a way that I thought this, but now I understand. Now I understand that there is a future. And it's not the individual that has a future. It's the Jewish people that has a future. They look into the future. And this is, we come back to here, right? The poor, and everything revolves around time. And Haman believes that time has no structure. And he's described in the Megillah as, Shimon, I'm sure you know, he goes back to Zeresh and he tells her something about what happened. And the Gemara looks at him as this figure of what happens accidentally, right? And he's a descendant of Amalek, and Amalek also is this figure of randomness, cruelty and randomness. So what Haman thinks is a poor and is meaningless time, God comes and redeems the time. It's not the time that Haman thought. It's the time that gives the Jews a future. Let's read this one more time, and we're finishing now, it's late. Let's read this one more time, just to see if we can make any sense of this. Sha'al Talmidav et Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So they asked Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, we said also already this is a euphemism. Why were they punished in that generation? Amar lehem imruatem. So he said to them, imruatem? What? I'm here, my Hebrew is not good enough. Why were they deserving of annihilation? They said to him, it is because they partook of the feast of that wicked one. So if so, those in Shushan should have been killed as a punishment, but not those in the rest of the world. They shouldn't have been killed. They said to him, Amrulo, Emor Ata, Amar Lehem Mipnei Shehitchavu L'Tzelem. Really, the reason is that they bowed down to Atzelem. And then they said to him, Ki Masu Panim Yesh B'Davar? Like, what actually happened here? They bowed down to an idol, and somehow they're not all chayav, meaning we went from katzela katzeh. We thought for a minute they didn't do anything, or only the Jews in Shushan did something. And now we're suggesting really they did this horrible thing, and all of the nation of Israel would be implicated in this act of avodah zarah, in this act of idolatry. So how is God getting away with this? Or Amar lehem heim lo asu el lifnim, af HaKadosh Baruch Hu lo asu iman el lifnim. So also God only did this lifnim. Both days, Purim and Yom Kippur, are days of a kind of tshuva. On Yom Kippur, in Psalm 51, David is inventing the kind of tshuva which we think about on Yom Kippur. And David goes through, according to Chazal, we're just entering this perspective. David goes through this, he goes through all of this just as a show for everybody. So just like David puts on a show for everyone and teaches, that's the key to everything is teaching. David is a teacher. and Purim, in Purim, the hidden God is a teacher. The hidden God is a teacher. But by the end of Purim, you see the light. By the end of Purim, Ben Afuchu, you see how things added up. Is God present at Purim? I mean, it's interesting actually that Pesach is the beginning of the liturgical cycle. And of that, the sages say, every handmaid and every slave, they had a greater perception of the divine than Moses did on Har Sinai, right? Ultimate revelation, maximum revelation. At the end of the liturgical cycle, right, one of the ways the Hebrew year is divided is that Nisan is the first year. At the end of the liturgical cycle, you get Purim. In Purim, God is not present. And the education of Purim, and somehow this happens best when you're drunk, I can really get started now, is best when you're drunk, is to be able to see the possibility of light even when there's darkness. Think of the mitzvah to get to the point of not being able to distinguish between Baruch Mordechai v'Oro Haman. You get these things mixed up. Good and evil get mixed up. And for philosophers, this is as close to, Purim is as close to an antinomian holiday as there is, right? It is Jewish holiday, right? In the Shakespearean sense. Anything goes, right? But it ends. It's one day a year, right? So, and we might, and the insight of Purim may be in fact the true one, that good and evil are so interrelated, right? See, they come into the world. We're quoting Milton now. Good and evil are so interrelated. That might be the pashtut, but we can't live with that every day, because if we live with that every day, everything would fall apart. However, and with this point I will leave you, when you make Havdalah on Shabbos, part of the Havdalah ceremony, what does Havdalah do? It distinguishes between sacred and secular. Part of the Havdalah ceremony, the liturgy is Lihudim Haita Ora V'Simcha V'Sasam. We continue to be Kaniti Elanu, so it should be for us. So in Havdalah, which is the ceremony of distinction and separation, you have a quotation from Megillat Esther, which is the holiday of no separation, which is saying, right, for those of us in the know, that even though we make this separation, we know that separation is not so hard and fast. Like the antinomian, it's always there. There's truth there. I have a lot more to say, but let's say the lecture's officially ended. Thank you for coming. If anybody has questions or insights about this relationship, and I think we started to make sense of it, but there's obviously a lot more to do. So, and any comments or questions? Come on, ask me something, Dov. Come on.
I do have a question, but it goes back.
Go ahead.
Okay, so it does have to do with this psalm a little bit. So Hashem set aside Tiftach. That brought me to last week, the idea of David turning his ear to metaphor, and then before that, David and his grandson, and David's grandson saying that the psalms are written about us, and I to me that makes it sound like David realizes that he's writing somebody else's text, that God is writing through him. But
you're saying a lot of things. It's simultaneously somebody else's text, but it's also his. Right.
Yeah, that's what confuses me. I just don't know what to make of it, or if there is sense.
Expand your brain, because that's what you have to make of it. These two things are both true. Right. Kira, what's up? Come on, ask us a question.
I have COVID, so it's a little hard to
talk. God.
So I'd rather just.
You're like Obama. Obama also has COVID.
Right, it's not cool anymore. It's like So past.
Right, totally that. Obama like tweeted that he has it, which is totally uncool for him to have it now, right? How do you feel?
It's like lame. Honestly, like I think the whole thing is, I don't know what I think anymore. It's COVID's a scam. My husband had COVID and we were staying together.
We don't really tolerate anti-vaxxers.
Oh, I'm super vaccinated. I just
right.
think.
No, I know you. I know. Right. No, at this point, it's hard to understand what's going on. Yeah. See, what's up with you? Any more Milton comments? You're right. C's like upside down. Where's Waldo? Yeah.
I was actually considering paying you a visit on the Shushan Purim because I've never been in Shushan Purim.
Oh, you're definitely welcome for sure.
No, but it's on a Friday, and I observe the Shabbat, so.
We have it early. We have it at like 12. We have it early.
Yeah, I'll try, but because
we'll be in touch about it. See, we can talk about this together in some other.
I celebrated Shushan because I'm from Amalgam.
It's awesome. It's a much higher level. Okay, people. Well, thank you very much. Good to see everybody as always. Okay, bye. Thanks. Be well, Shakira.